It is week 16 of the fantasy football season, championship week for most of you. Others may still have a meaningful matchup. We are here to help on the season finale of the Radio.com Sports Fantasy Football Show. What's up, everybody? My name is Steven Andress. As always, if you like this video and comment below with a question for your lineups in week 16, I am happy to help and answer. But as always, we begin the show with Pick 'em Up, waiver wire options owned in less than 50% of leagues. And the first and biggest name this week is a guy that I didn't think I would mention once for the rest of his career, but here we are. Tampa Bay wide receiver Breshad Perriman, previously a first-round draft pick in the NFL draft and a bust, but emerged last week with the injury to Mike Evans for 5 catches, 113 yards, and a hat trick, 3 touchdowns against the Detroit Lions. Now Chris Godwin is out with a hamstring injury as well. Perriman gets to play Houston, who is about league average in fantasy points allowed to wide receivers. So target volume will be there for Perriman with Jameis Winston in the most pass-happy offense in the NFL. And if you're really desperate, because Evans and Godwin are both hurt, you can probably start Justin Watson as a desperation play as well in week 16. The running back situation is very interesting now in the final week for most of your seasons. Kerryon Johnson is slated to return from IR this week. We have to actually confirm that happens, obviously, but you should pick him up early in the week just in case. If you're desperate for a running back, maybe you lost Dalvin Cook, but Kerryon Johnson at Denver, eligible to return. No setbacks to date from that knee injury earlier in the season. When healthy, he averaged more than 19 touches per game in those 5 weeks earlier this year. Denver around league average as well in fantasy points allowed to running backs. One more running back I will mention is Boston Scott of the Philadelphia Eagles. This is more of a PPR league specialty, but he's getting usage despite Miles Sanders dominating, and that's because the Eagles are just down to the nitty-gritty when it comes to the weapons they have available. They only dressed 3 receivers last week. None are established, so Boston Scott and the running backs are getting more work in Doug Peterson's offense here. A make-or-break game against the Dallas Cowboys this week. We like that in fantasy. We want players with something on the line this late in the season. Boston Scott last week, 6 carries, 26 yards, added 7 receptions for 39 yards. You see what I mean by a PPR specialist. But the week before against the Giants, 10 carries, 59 yards, and a touchdown, 6 receptions for 69 yards. He's assumed the old Darren Sproles role in the offense, and maybe most importantly for his outlook for week 16, he's played more than 40% of snaps in both weeks. They're running more 22 personnel, less wide receivers on the field, more running backs. You're seeing a lot more of 2 running back, 2 tight end formations here. And we didn't mention him, but if Raheem Mostert's still out there in your league, pick him up as well. Let's move on to the stream team. These are quarterbacks owned in less than 50% of leagues that you can not only pick up and start due to the matchup in week 16. And it is bare bones this week because most of the quarterbacks owned in less than 45% of leagues are not very good. That's because most teams have rostered 2 quarterbacks to this point, but Ryan Fitzpatrick has a decent matchup in week 16 against Cincinnati, and Fitzmagic has 20-plus points in 3 of his last 4 games. He is favored at home in this game in Miami against the Bengals, so you can do worse than Fitzmagic. Cincinnati has allowed 19.4 fantasy points to quarterbacks this season. The last one is a complete desperation play. It's Phillip Rivers at home against Oakland. Rivers has been terrible, but this name pretty much shows you how thin the streaming quarterback options are at this point in week 16. Hopefully you've already had a streaming option that you've held on to like Ryan Tannehill to this point, but if not, at least you have Phillip Rivers taking on Oakland, who has scored 21-plus points in his last 2 home games against the Raiders. Oakland, second most fantasy points allowed to quarterbacks this season at more than 21 per game. So maybe you can take a shot that Rivers has a decent game finally. He did have a good game 2 weeks ago against the Jaguars. Streaming tight ends owned in less than 50% of leagues. Tyler Higbee is on fire for the Los Angeles Rams. 3 consecutive games of 100-plus yards. Even if Gerald Everett comes back, it's clear that Higbee has played more than well enough to keep his job in this offense. It is a tough matchup against San Francisco, but when it comes to tight ends, there's not many good ones to choose from, and production is more important than matchup, and Tyler Higbee is killing it. He also has back-to-back games with 11-plus targets, which shows you that his fantasy production is not just because of touchdowns like most tight ends. He's getting the rock, and he's getting it often from Jared Goff. Lastly, Jacob Hollister of the Seattle Seahawks. He gets to take on Arizona. If you've watched this show this season, you know Arizona is the most friendly matchup when it comes to fantasy points allowed to tight ends this year by a wide margin. They've allowed 4 more points per week than the next worst team in covering tight ends. Jacob Hollister gets that great matchup. And last week, the Cardinals even allowed 2 touchdowns to Ricky Seals-Jones, who came out of the witness protection program, who had all of 200 yards receiving this year. Just another example of how this defense is awful in covering the tight end. So roll with Jacob Hollister in Week 16. Streaming defense is owned in less than 50% of leagues, and the Indianapolis Colts have been pathetic for the past 2 weeks, with Jameis Winston and Drew Brees going off in Weeks 14 and 15. But the Colts are back home against the Carolina Panthers, who are starting third-string quarterback Will Grier. And this offense has been pathetic under Kyle Allen the past 2 weeks. And I have a hard time imagining Will Grier is going to be any better. Carolina, the last 4 weeks, the second most points allowed to fantasy defenses, top 7 overall on the season. And we mentioned Will Grier. That's a great matchup for any defense. So the Colts, I think, can bounce back. But the number one streaming defense I like out there this week is the Atlanta Falcons at home against the Jacksonville Jaguars. Yes, Jacksonville went into Oakland and got the upset in the last game ever in Oakland, but they did so in a low-scoring game. Atlanta was extremely impressive against the 49ers last week. 10-plus fantasy points in 4 of their last 6 games for the Falcons defense, including in the Bay Area a week ago. Jacksonville top 5 in points allowed to fantasy defenses in the last 4 weeks. And Atlanta forcing 2.4 turnovers per game over the last 5 weeks. Before we wrap up the show, Stealthy starts. These are guys who have not been started in more than 50% of lineups over the past couple of weeks, but I think the matchup is right, and if you need a spot start or a spot flex, you can roll with these guys. The first is Sterling Shepard of the New York Giants. He's in that wide receiving core with Golden Tate and Darius Slayton, so volume hasn't been reliable for him of late, but last week he did get 11 targets against the Dolphins. He converted those into 9 receptions for 111 yards. I still doubt Evan Ingram is going to be able to come back from that foot injury in Week 16. He's tried for multiple weeks now to get back on the field and practice, but has not been able to do so. Even if he does come back, I still like Sterling Shepard this week against Washington on the road. And one more, Anthony Miller of the Chicago Bears, who has been on fire. In fact, he's been a top 10 fantasy wide receiver overall over the past month. Look at his production. He gets to take on Kansas City this week. Last week, he had 9 catches for 118 yards and 1 touchdown on 15 targets for Anthony Miller. He had 77 yards and or a touchdown in 4 consecutive weeks. I think you stay with Anthony Miller and his hot streak here in your fantasy championships or other meaningful matchups in week number 16. Thank you so much for watching the Radio.com Sports Fantasy Football Show. As I mentioned at the top, if you have any questions for week 16, be sure to like this video, comment below. I'd be happy to answer those for you. And just a programming note, this is our last weekly episode of the season. We will have episodes sporadically throughout the offseason to look back at the 2019 season, to look at busts and great sleeper picks who panned out, the MVPs at every position. We'll also look ahead to rookie rankings in the NFL draft. And when draft season comes along in 2020, we'll get you all set for the 2020 season as well. If you have any Week 17 championship questions, you can reach out to me on Twitter at SportsBySteven. But as I like to say at the end of every episode every week, thank you so much for watching. Thank you so much for being a part of this show. The first season we've done it, and best of luck in your fantasy football leagues.